Ever since she could remember, Madison's life had been a cruel joke to her toxic parents. "You're worthless. You'll never be good for anything but cheap labor." They'd sneer as she scrubbed oil off factory floors instead of chasing her dream of becoming a creative designer. They ripped away her college application, forced her into their dusty workshop, and laughed when she cried. But they didn't know the useless daughter they crushed would one day rise from the shadows and make them beg. Have your toxic parents ever belittled your dreams or crushed your spirit? If you felt Madison's pain, drop a comment below. Let's stand together. You're not alone in fighting back against those who should have lifted you up. Subscribe for more. Madison Carter was always a creator at heart. From the moment she learned to hold a pencil, she sketched dresses on the back of her math homework and dreamed of seeing her name on a clothing line someday. But in the Carter household, dreams were luxuries, and luxuries were for other people. Her father, Gerald Carter, ran a small metalwork factory on the outskirts of town. Her mother, Darlene, was the manager, which mostly meant barking orders at exhausted workers and counting coins at the end of the day. Together, they ruled their tiny kingdom with iron fists, and Madison was the easiest to break. She'd grown up hearing the same cutting phrase over and over: "Don't waste time drawing. Real life doesn't care about pretty pictures." But Madison couldn't stop. Even after 12-hour shifts wiping down greasy machines and hauling boxes, she'd sneak out her battered sketchbook and draw by the pale light of her phone. When she turned 18, she applied in secret to a local design school. She worked double shifts to save the application fee. She didn't dare tell her parents, but secrets never lasted long in the Carter house. The day the acceptance letter came, Darlene ripped it up in front of her piece by piece. "You think you're too good for us? For this family?" her mother hissed, voice dripping with disdain. "You'll work here like the rest of us. Someone has to pay the bills while you chase your silly fantasies." So Madison stayed. While her high school friends left for college dorms and fresh starts, she pulled on dusty overalls every morning and reported for duty in the grimy workshop her parents called a family legacy. Her father loved to boast to the other factory owners, "I keep my kids in line. No lazy artists in my house. We make honest money here." Meanwhile, Madison's hands blistered from scrubbing tools she'd never use for her own dreams. Every time she looked at the factory walls, stained, crumbling, choking with the smell of rust, she felt her dreams shrinking into those cracks. But Madison was stubborn. If she couldn't design clothes for the world, she'd design for herself. Late at night, when her parents were too drunk or too tired to care where she was, she'd hunch over her second-hand laptop and teach herself everything she could: digital design, branding, online sales. She devoured free tutorials, borrowed books from old friends, and sketched out logo ideas between shifts. She kept her drawings hidden in an old lunchbox under her bed. She saved every spare dollar, tip money, overtime pay, and opened a secret bank account at a credit union on the other side of town. Meanwhile, her parents only tightened their grip. Any time she so much as looked tired, her mother snapped, "Don't think you can slack off. We gave you a roof, we gave you food, you owe us." To the outside world, Madison played the part of the dutiful, dim factory girl. She forced a smile when her father bragged about how he kept her in line. She nodded along when her mother lied to neighbors about how Madison wasn't smart enough for college anyway. Inside, though, her anger grew like wildfire. Every insult fueled her sketches. Every cruel laugh made her fingers draw faster, sharper lines. She was building something they couldn't see, something they couldn't break. At 21, she knew her parents' business was failing. Orders slowed. Machines broke down faster than they could afford to fix them. Workers whispered about unpaid wages and bounced checks. Her father blamed everyone except himself. The economy, the lazy workers, even Madison. But Madison kept her head down. She bided her time. If they wanted her to stay quiet, she'd be the quietest child alive. Deep down, she promised herself, one day they'll see what this useless girl can really do. And when that day came, Madison wouldn't just save them. She'd make sure her toxic parents felt every ounce of regret they deserved. Madison had learned to live like a ghost in her own house. She moved through the workshop like invisible smoke, head down, mouth shut, eyes always watching for the next storm from her toxic parents. She thought she could handle it forever. That was her plan. Stay quiet, stack her secret savings, build her dream brand at night until the day she could walk away for good, leaving them to wonder where they went wrong. But like all powder kegs, it only took one spark to blow her silence to pieces. It was a Monday afternoon, the start of another grueling week in the suffocating metal shop. Madison's mother, Darlene, had been in a foul mood since dawn. A supplier called, furious over unpaid invoices. 2 workers didn't show up. The old welding machine sputtered and died for the 3rd time that month. By mid-afternoon, the factory floor buzzed with heat and tension. Madison was hunched over a rusted table, sorting screws into tiny boxes for minimum wage. Work any machine could have done faster if her parents had invested in one. She didn't complain. She never did. She knew better. That's when Darlene's voice, sharp as broken glass, sliced through the steady clank of metal. "Madison, get over here!" Madison wiped sweat from her forehead, pushed back a strand of hair stuck to her neck, and stepped forward. She kept her eyes low. "Yes, Ma?" Her mother stood in the middle of the floor, arms crossed, her glare hot enough to strip paint off the walls. Surrounding them were 6 workers, men and women who'd known Madison since she was a child, people who'd seen her scrub floors, mop toilets, haul crates twice her weight. "Tell me," Darlene barked, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Why did you order new cleaning supplies without asking?" Madison froze. She'd spent $50 from the petty cash box on bleach, gloves, and fresh rags because the old ones were rotting with mildew. It was a tiny thing, one she'd done dozens of times before. I thought we needed them," Madison stammered. "The mop heads were—" "You thought?" Darlene's laugh was harsh and cold. "Oh, you thought. Since when do you think? You're too stupid to run errands without screwing up, and you dare to spend my money?" The factory fell silent. Every eye turned to the small scene. No one spoke. Madison felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She hated this, hated being humiliated like a child in front of people who already thought she was worthless. "I'm sorry, Ma. Darlene stepped forward so fast Madison flinched back. Her mother's finger stabbed the air an inch from Madison's face. "Don't you sorry me. You're nothing but dead weight. You can't design, you can't manage money, you can't even sweep a damn floor right. Look at you, all those doodles in your notebook. Trash, worthless trash. You'll never be more than a factory rat." The words echoed off the metal walls. Madison heard a soft gasp from somewhere behind her. One of the workers, maybe. She didn't dare look. Her hands clenched so tight her nails dug half-moons into her palms. And that's when something snapped. She felt it like a jolt through her chest. All those nights she'd whispered just a little longer to herself. All those times she swallowed her pride just to keep her plan alive. All of it cracked like glass under a boot. Madison looked up. Really looked. Her mother's face was flushed, smug with power, certain her daughter would just bow her head and take it like always. Never again, Madison thought. Never again. The shift ended 2 hours later. Madison finished her tasks in silence, but inside her head a new machine roared to life. That night, when the factory lights flicked off and her parents locked themselves in the office to drink cheap whiskey and fight over the books, Madison slipped out the side door. She didn't go home. She didn't crawl into bed and cry like she had so many nights before. Instead, she rode the bus to a 24-hour diner across town, cracked open her battered laptop, and opened a new file. Business plan, Madison C. She stayed until dawn, scribbling ideas on napkins, researching suppliers, calculating costs. She applied for a night shift job at the diner, wiping tables for minimum wage, but the tips would go straight into her hidden account. It would mean sleeping less, but that was fine. Madison had learned how to live on scraps. She'd survived her toxic parents for 21 years. A few more months would be nothing. She'd been holding her dream close to her chest like a fragile bird. Now she saw it clearly. It wasn't fragile at all. It was a weapon. By the time the sun broke over the cracked asphalt outside the diner, Madison had mapped out her first designs for a small streetwear line. Clothes inspired by the grime and grit she'd lived in turned into something bold, something free. The next day at the factory, Madison smiled when Darlene called her useless again. She didn't flinch when Gerald barked about overtime. She just nodded, mopped the floor, packed boxes, and counted the minutes until she could leave and go build the life they said she'd never have. They didn't know it yet, but the worthless daughter they mocked was about to become their biggest nightmare. Madison had always been good at pretending. Years of surviving her toxic parents had trained her to wear masks so well that even she sometimes forgot they were there. But now, every fake smile, every "yes, Ma," and "of course, Dad," became a part of her weapon. By day, she played the obedient factory girl. She punched the clock, scrubbed the floors, fetched her father's coffee. But by night, Madison was someone else entirely. At the diner, she worked until sunrise, taking every extra shift she could, collecting greasy plates and pocketing tips. Each wrinkled dollar was another drop of fuel for the fire she was building in secret. With her meager savings, she bought a cheap second-hand sewing machine from an old woman who had no idea she was selling a revolution. Madison set it up in the tiny attic above the garage, hidden behind stacks of broken tools and dusty boxes her father never touched. Every night after work, she'd sneak up there with her battered laptop and sketchbook. The sewing machine rattled like a tin can every time she pressed the pedal, but Madison didn't care. She was alive in that attic, more alive than she'd ever been under her parents' roof. She spent hours stitching scraps of fabric together, experimenting, ripping seams, starting over. She taught herself how to use digital design software, watching grainy tutorials on her cracked phone while the machine hummed under her fingertips. The attic walls, once dead with cobwebs, bloomed with pinned sketches and fabric swatches. But Madison knew talent alone wouldn't set her free. She needed a brand, something bold enough to stand out but hidden enough to keep her toxic parents clueless until it was too late. She chose an alias, MC Riot. Under that name, she opened a small online store on a handmade marketplace. At first, she sold simple pieces, edgy t-shirts and jackets stitched with raw hems and defiant slogans. "Break the cage! Not yours to break." She modeled them herself, but she never showed her face, only her hands, her back turned, her hair tucked under a hoodie. To her surprise, her designs found an audience fast. Young people who knew exactly what it felt like to be trapped, overlooked, dismissed. They messaged her with their own stories of cruel parents, broken homes, stolen dreams. Each order felt like a whispered promise. You're not alone. Madison reinvested every penny, buying better fabric, paying a local screen printer to produce larger batches, upgrading her cheap sewing machine to a sturdy industrial one she kept locked in a storage unit across town. At the factory, Darlene started to notice Madison's good mood. She threw more work at her, longer hours, nastier insults. Gerald demanded she pick up extra shifts since she had so much free time to smile about. Madison took it all. She let them push her harder. She knew every minute they made her stay at the factory only fed the very thing that would one day crush them. One night, after a 14-hour day on the floor and another overnight shift at the diner, Madison crawled up to the attic, curled around her sewing machine, and sobbed. Not because she was broken, but because she knew, deep in her bones, that she wasn't that powerless little girl anymore. She wiped her tears, picked up her needle, and stitched until dawn. Orders were coming in faster than she could make them alone, so she took the next step. She found a small group of other young creatives, kids like her who couldn't afford fancy design schools or who'd been kicked out by toxic parents when they refused to get real jobs. She paid them fair wages from her own pocket to help sew, pack, and ship. She taught them what she knew and learned from them in return. They worked out of basements, garages, borrowed dorm rooms, an underground rebellion stitched together by their own hands. Piece by piece, the thing Madison's parents said would never feed her was starting to feed all of them. Her secret life was no longer just an escape. It was a blade. One she would soon aim at the people who'd mocked her dreams and dared to call her useless. Orders for MC Riot tripled in a month. Madison barely slept, but every hour spent hunched over fabric and screens felt like sweet revenge. The more her fingers ached from sewing, the stronger she felt. Each shipped box another nail in the coffin of her toxic parents' crumbling empire. At the Carter factory, things were falling apart fast. Old debts piled up like rusted scrap. Suppliers stopped answering Gerald's calls. Workers started quitting after weeks of late paychecks and empty promises. Madison listened from the shadows as her father roared at the foreman, blaming everyone but himself. Darlene barked at employees who didn't exist anymore. Yet neither of them suspected their useless daughter had anything to do with the vultures circling overhead. At night, Madison sat cross-legged in her storage unit, stacks of shipping boxes around her like bricks of a hidden castle. She watched orders roll in from cities she'd never seen. She saw strangers wearing her designs in viral street photos. She saw kids like her, kids suffocated by toxic parents, now wrapped in her rebellion. She knew it was time for the next phase. Using an alias, Madison quietly reached out to a local broker who specialized in buying up bankrupt industrial equipment. She posed as a young entrepreneur looking for cheap secondhand tools to expand her creative collective. The broker didn't care who she was, he just wanted the commission. Within weeks, Madison struck a deal to buy every usable machine, table, and tool from her parents' struggling factory, all to be delivered to a new owner once the Carter family officially defaulted. In secret, she met with old workers who'd been laid off or who'd quit in disgust. She offered them jobs, better pay, better hours, respect. Most said yes before she even finished her pitch. They knew her. They'd seen how her toxic parents had humiliated her for years. They were more than ready to flip the tables. Back at home, the tension turned electric. Gerald screamed more often now. Darlene's cold glares turned frantic. Some nights, Madison heard them yelling in the kitchen long after midnight. Arguments about unpaid debts, angry creditors, bounced checks. One Friday, Gerald cornered Madison near the tool shed. His eyes were bloodshot, breath sour with cheap bourbon. "You know why we're drowning, huh?" he slurred, voice low and mean. "It's because useless leeches like you don't pull your weight. If you didn't eat up my money—" Madison looked him dead in the eye for the first time in her life. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She just tilted her head and said softly, "Maybe you should have invested in better managers." It was the first time her father saw the real Madison, and he hated it. He grabbed her arm, fingers digging deep enough to bruise, but she didn't pull away. She just stared until he let go and stumbled back inside. That night, she finalized the contracts with the broker. She didn't even feel afraid anymore. Her plan was too big to fail, and her parents were too blind to see it coming. The day the bank seized the factory, Gerald and Darlene were too busy blaming each other to realize the new owner waiting in the shadows was their useless daughter. They signed the foreclosure papers with trembling hands, faces pale as ghosts. Madison's lawyer, another quiet ally, handled the final transfer. In one stroke, she took the same machines she'd once cleaned for pennies and turned them into the beating heart of her own creative empire. The factory floor that once smelled of sweat and metal now hummed with young designers stitching rebellion into every seam. Madison paid fair wages. She put murals on the cracked walls. She turned the place into a living middle finger to the people who told her she'd never be more than their servant. Outside, Gerald and Darlene stood on the curb with nothing but a box of worthless files and their bitterness. Madison didn't say a word to them. Not yet. That moment would come soon enough. For now, she watched her new team fire up the machines, the same machines that once imprisoned her. The factory roared back to life, but this time it was hers. Can you feel it? That sweet taste of revenge when toxic parents finally get exactly what they deserve. If you'd stand up like Madison did, drop a comment below and share your story. Smash that like button and subscribe. More tales of cold payback are on the way. Don't miss it. Madison stood at the edge of the old factory floor, the one her toxic parents used to call their legacy. Now it belonged to her. Every rusty beam, every humming machine, every worker who used to fear Gerald and Darlene's shouting. But Madison knew her revenge wasn't finished yet. Owning the factory wasn't enough. They needed to see her face, hear her voice, and know exactly who had taken everything they thought she could never build. So she planned the final confrontation down to the last cruel detail. It started with the creditors' meeting, the last desperate gathering her parents had no choice but to attend. The bank had agreed to let Gerald and Darlene plead for a bailout in front of a circle of stone-faced lenders and former partners. Madison's lawyer made sure she got a seat at that table, but under her real name this time, Madison Carter, sole owner of MC Riot Industries. She chose her outfit carefully, a sharp black blazer, sleek trousers, a simple white shirt. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy, just professional enough to show the world she was no longer the useless daughter sweeping floors. In the days leading up to the meeting, Madison made sure word spread. Quiet whispers reached the remaining workers who hadn't yet seen her new brand for what it was. Some thought the new owner must be a big investor from the city. Others assumed it was some faceless corporation scooping up cheap labor. No one guessed the truth. Yet. Late one night, Madison sat alone in her small office above the repurposed factory floor. The space used to be Darlene's, back when she barked orders from behind a cheap desk, chain-smoking and counting pennies like they were hers alone. Now Madison's sketches lined the walls, pinned alongside spreadsheets, fabric samples, and production schedules. She looked out the window at the floor below. Her team worked late, laughing and sharing coffee while they printed new shirts and boxed orders for delivery trucks lined up at the gate. There was life here now, hope where there had once been fear. For a moment, a tremor of doubt flickered through her. Am I really ready to face them? To look them in the eyes and show them who I am? Then she remembered her mother's voice echoing in her ears. You're nothing but dead weight. She smiled. That voice didn't scare her anymore. On the morning of the showdown, she arrived early at the bank's sterile conference room. She took the seat at the head of the long table facing the door. She wanted them to see her first. No mask, no dirty overalls, no forced smile. Just Madison, sharp, calm, unstoppable. Her lawyer sat beside her, flipping through the thick stack of contracts that tied up every last machine, every last debt her parents once clung to. Outside the frosted glass walls, Gerald and Darlene's muffled voices drifted down the hall. The same frantic bickering she'd grown up listening to through thin walls and slammed doors. But this time, she wasn't the frightened girl hiding under a blanket. This time, she was the reason they were about to lose everything, and the only person who could decide if they'd be allowed to crawl away with even a shred of dignity left. When the door opened and her toxic parents stepped inside, Madison didn't flinch. She sat taller. She watched their eyes widen, their mouths twitch, their shoulders slump as the truth hit them like cold water. Their worthless daughter was the one holding every single card. The room fell into suffocating silence as Gerald and Darlene Carter stood frozen in the doorway. Their eyes darted from Madison's calm, unblinking stare to the neat stack of legal documents in front of her. Gerald's jaw twitched first. His eyes narrowed like he was trying to force the image to make sense. "What the hell is this, Madison?" he spat, voice cracking with disbelief. You don't belong here. Get out! Now!" Madison didn't move. She leaned back in her chair, laced her fingers together, and let the echo of his anger settle in the sterile conference room. The lenders and lawyers shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to watch what they knew was about to become a family massacre. Darlene stepped forward, her lipstick smudged, desperation dripping off her like cheap perfume. "This is a serious meeting, young lady. You have no idea what you're doing." Madison's lawyer cleared his throat. Calmly, he slid the first page of the contract across the table. "With all due respect, Mrs. Carter," he said evenly, "Madison owns this company now. She owns the equipment, the factory, and the debt that your creditors are here to collect. She's the only person who can decide whether you walk away with anything left." Darlene's mouth fell open. Her eyes shot back to Madison, searching for some hint that this was a prank. Some cruel trick the world was playing on her. But Madison didn't flinch. Gerald slammed his fist down on the table so hard that pins rolled onto the floor. You worthless brat! This is a lie. You think you're better than your own parents? Everything you have is ours. Madison's voice was so calm it almost sounded gentle, but her words were knives. No, she said, her eyes locked on her father's. Everything I have, I built. You tried to crush me under your feet. You called me useless, worthless, stupid. But you know what, Dad? You were wrong. She turned to Darlene, who looked ready to collapse. You made me sweep floors and carry boxes so I'd forget I had a brain. You laughed when you ripped up my college letter. You mocked every dream I ever had. But here we are. And the only reason you're not out on the street already is because I decided you should see exactly who you were dealing with. Darlene's lower lip trembled. Madison, please, we're your parents. We raised you. We gave you a home. Madison cut her off with a cold smile. You raised a servant. You never raised a daughter. She slid the final contract across the polished wood. Sign this. You'll hand over every remaining asset. The vehicles, the leftover stock, the house, all of it. In return, I'll pay off what you owe to the workers you exploited for years, the people you never cared about while you lined your pockets. Gerald looked ready to lunge across the table, but Darlene grabbed his arm. Her eyes were wide with naked terror, the kind Madison had worn on her own face 1,000 nights under their roof. But where will we go? Darlene whispered, voice cracking like old glass. What will we have left? Madison leaned in, so close they couldn't look away. You'll have nothing, just like you left me with nothing, except the strength to make this happen. The lawyer placed a pen in front of them. The lenders watched, stony-faced and silent. After a long, broken pause, Gerald's shoulders sagged. Darlene's tears dripped onto the signature line. They signed. Madison didn't thank them. She didn't comfort them. She gathered the contracts, stood, and looked them in the eye one last time. You called me useless, she said, her voice low and final. Now look at you, kneeling to the daughter you tried so hard to break. This is what useless looks like. She turned her back and walked out, leaving her toxic parents behind in the ruins they'd built for themselves, and the empire she'd stolen right out from under their feet. Madison stepped out of that cold conference room and felt the summer sun hit her face like a promise. She could still see Gerald and Darlene through the glass wall, two small, broken people hunched over a pile of signed papers, whispering curses at each other while their world crumbled for good. Once, that sight would have made her flinch, maybe even pity them, but not now. Not after every night she spent stitching her dreams together in secret while they called her worthless. Not after every time her toxic parents told her she'd never make it without them. She had made it in spite of them. News of the takeover spread fast in the small industrial town. Workers who'd once dragged themselves to the Carter factory with dread now came back. Not to the old sweatshop, but to the reborn floor Madison named Riot Studio. She made sure they got every dollar owed to them, with back pay and fresh contracts that treated them like people, not disposable parts. When her parents tried to come crawling back, first with fake sweet smiles, then with threats, Madison didn't open the door. She didn't pick up the phone when they called from borrowed numbers. She didn't flinch when they showed up at the gates demanding to be let in. Instead, she had security escort them off the property, the same cracked pavement she'd once scrubbed on her knees while they laughed about her wasted potential. She watched through the office window as they stood outside the locked gate, red-faced and shouting at guards who didn't care about their last name anymore. She felt no guilt, only a calm certainty. Her boundaries were hers now. The same walls that once trapped her now protected her. She changed the company's logo to her initials, MC. No more hiding, no more fake names. She wanted the world to know exactly who had built this, and who had been foolish enough to throw her dreams away. Madison didn't need to destroy her toxic parents any further. They'd done that to themselves. She just needed to make sure they never touched what she built again. When word got out that the useless daughter now ran one of the hottest young design collectives in the region, people started asking questions. Old neighbors who once whispered that Madison should be grateful for her parents' discipline now saw Gerald and Darlene for what they really were: parasites living off a child's fear. They lost their home within weeks, forced to sell off their cars, their furniture, even the fancy silver Darlene used to brag about at church. Madison didn't watch the foreclosure auction. She didn't need to. Their downfall wasn't her burden to carry anymore. She had bigger things to build. In the final weeks of that summer, Madison stood in the middle of her factory floor, now painted bright with murals and buzzing with music and laughter, and felt something she hadn't known since she was a kid, sketching dresses on the backs of old homework: freedom. The failure they mocked had become the woman who owned everything they ever thought she'd beg for. And Madison Carter would never beg again. Months after Madison shut the factory gates on her toxic parents for good, the rumors about Riot Studio stopped being gossip and became inspiration. Young people who'd once drifted through town with no hope found their way to her door, clutching rough sketches, shy ideas, or nothing more than a hungry look in their eyes. Madison remembered that hunger. The nights she'd sat alone in her attic, sewing under a single flickering bulb, terrified someone would find out and crush her dream before it ever got off the ground. She knew what it meant to fight for something no one else believed in, especially when the people who should have lifted you up were the first to tear you down. So she opened the doors wider. She took a dusty side wing of the old factory and turned it into a free design academy. No tuition. No paperwork asking for fancy grades or letters of recommendation. Just a promise. Bring your passion, and we'll build the rest together. Kids who'd dropped out. Moms who'd been told they were too old to learn. Teens hiding from their own toxic parents, desperate for any chance to prove they were more than what they'd been told. Madison gave them sewing machines, screens, fabric, open tables to sketch and fail and try again. She hired counselors and trusted mentors, people who'd walked the same rough roads. She paid them well. She made sure no one in her space ever felt small for asking a question or making a mistake. Sometimes Madison sat at the back of the studio late at night, watching students pin fabric to mannequins, scribble ideas on scrap paper, argue about color palettes like their lives depended on it. She'd smile, knowing they were breathing life into something bigger than just clothes. They were stitching themselves back together, the same way she had. One evening, a girl named Lila lingered after class. She was 15, shoulders hunched like she'd learned to shrink herself to survive. She clutched a hoodie Madison had designed years ago, one that read, "Not yours to break." "Miss Carter?" she whispered. "Do you really mean that? That no one can break me?" Madison looked her straight in the eyes and didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Not your parents, not anyone, not ever again." Lila's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from fear. She nodded, hugged the hoodie tight, and left the studio a little taller than she'd come in. Standing there alone, Madison realized her revenge had done more than ruin the people who tried to bury her. It had cleared the ground for something stronger to grow, for others to believe that surviving toxic parents wasn't where the story ended. It was where it could finally begin. Madison never pretended her scars didn't exist. She wore them like bright threads woven through every stitch, every mural on the factory walls, every young dreamer she welcomed through her doors. Because in the end, the best revenge wasn't just taking back what was hers. It was proving no one could steal it away again, and making sure no one else ever had to fight alone.